Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our Thursday night parent speaker series. We're so grateful that you chose to spend your evening with us. Tonight, the topic of conversation will be social justice, brave conversations, and social emotional learning. And I'm super happy to be here with a really talented bunch of people from Carroll who will be speaking to these topics. For those of you who've joined us before, I think you know the routine, which is that I'm going to tap dance here a little bit, wish you a great night, do a little chatting as people are kind of funneling into the Zoom room. The protocols, which you also may know, is that we've disabled the chat feature for this evening and instead offer you the Q&A button, which is at the lower right of your screen. We've set this up as a presentation, but at any point, please feel free to use that button to pose any questions. We are going to leave ample time at the end to address your questions. It's really important in all of these speaker series, but in particular this one, that we want to create a space for dialogue and engagement and a safe space for discussion as well. So we're really interested and eager to hear from you. So again, if you're just joining us, thank you so much. Happy Thursday night. We're here with a wonderful crew from Carroll to talk about social justice and social emotional learning and brave conversations and how we are educating your students, your kids rather, on how to engage in this work. So I'm just going to give it an extra minute or two just to give people a chance to kind of funnel in here. I hope everyone's had a good week. It's feeling like a little hopeful out there today, right? With a little bit of sunshine, feeling like things are going to be turning around. So thank you if you're just joining us for Social Justice, Brave Conversations, and Social Emotional Learning. As I said to people who've already just joined us, please use the Q&A button at the bottom right of your screen. This presentation tonight is organized in such a way that we will be presenting for the first sort of 80% of it, but then want to engage in a dialogue with questions and discussion at the end. So we're eager to hear from you. So I'm just going to ask Jen Brock, who's on the back end here, always helping us with our Zoom events. Jen, how do we look tonight? Ready to go?
I think we need to give people just one more minute.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jen. So I'm just going to give it a little extra time. As I often say on these evenings, I think it's a great benefit that I've perhaps offered you more comfortable seating than I could at the Spalding Auditorium or in the Great Hall at the lower school. Much easier commute too. So Jen, I think I'll go ahead. Yep, thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Let me just introduce who I have with us here tonight. I'm joined by Mika Whitmer, Kwame Kabla, Allison Harmon, and Osa Osage. Many of you may know these people just from educators and counselors at Carroll or their roles in the equity and inclusion work. In order to sort of get a sense of where people are, I'd like to do a little poll. Jen's going to put up something. We'd like to gauge your familiarity with the terminology around social justice and the topic just generally, just to get a sense of how comfortable people are feeling with the content. And then I'll just ask Jen how we're doing there.
Just give people another few seconds.
That sounds good. Thanks, Jen.
All right, so it looks like about half of our participants tonight feel very familiar with social justice and social terminology. About 46% feel somewhat, and 4% not at all familiar.
Fantastic. That's actually really helpful to us. Thank you so much. So now just kind of looking ahead at the agenda for tonight. We're going to start off the presentation with a discussion of the journey, how we got here at Carroll, look at the impact within the community, and then we'll talk in a little more depth about the relationship between DEI and social emotional wellness. And finally, we'll finish it off with some questions and answers. And as I said, if you're just joining us, please use the question and answer button at the bottom right of your screen. At the end, we will try to address all of your questions and engage in a dialogue. And for anything that we're not able to answer tonight, we promise to circle back with you on email afterwards. So it's my pleasure to pass it off to Allison Harmon. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Stacy. It's nice to be here with everybody, and really exciting to be with my colleagues that I admire and respect and just love working with. So I'm going to start us off a little bit and just talking about sort of Carroll's journey to sort of the present place that we are and sort of where we are in this never-ending journey of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I'll start with sort of a personal story. I started working at Carroll, I think this is my 8th or 9th year. But when I started, I was incredibly struck by this place that was so deeply committed to working with kids who had learning differences. And I could not believe how dedicated and knowledgeable the teachers were about this type of instruction, the level of specialization, the level of expertise, the commitment. I had worked in some different school settings, but I was really blown away by Carroll's history of just being a leader in dyslexic education. I think I was also, struck that it was a very sort of homogeneous feeling community. And there was not really a lot of talk about diversity. And what I remember early on is that when we did talk about diversity, we really talked about neurodiversity, and we really, talked, and I think we were excellent at really seeing and understanding the identities of our students as learners and as young people with a learning difference. And that was sort of the way that we talked about diversity. And I think that there were some really important, we call them call-in moments, both internally and externally, that helped us expand our view. And some of them came in the form of accreditation and reviews that the school does from like the New England Association of Schools and Colleges and the National Association of Independent Schools. And I think when they did our reviewing and our accreditation, they noted so many amazing things in terms of our curriculum and our instruction and the relationships that we had with students. And I think that they really also clearly called out that we were not really doing a lot in terms of really intentional overt work with diversity. And we didn't really have a diverse staff, and our student body was not as diverse as I think it can be, and that we hope to grow to be. And so these were moments that I think sort of were a little bit of a wake-up call, and times where we were able to say, learning style is sort of one aspect of one's identity, and it's really not all parts of somebody. And we can't really expect that our students come to Carroll and they bring their dyslexic part of their self through that door, but they leave the part of themselves, their racial identity or gender identity or religious affiliations, or all these different things that make up who students are. They don't leave all those parts and only bring their dyslexic selves through. But that's sort of, I think, how we were operating. And it was a big sort of blind spot for us. And, not only I think were we reminded of this, from other institutions that were sort of doing this work alongside of us, but I think we were also had some really powerful experiences from members of our community, from students and from parents of students who were brave and generous enough to share their experiences with us. And I remember that there was one student in our C8-9 program that, and this is somebody who was had a really transformative academic experience at Carroll, very positive relationships with his teachers and with his peers. And there was a time in some morning meetings and and I think some health and wellness lessons, that we were talking about some identity topics. And he was able to share with some trusted adults in his program later on that was a really difficult experience for him, because we did not, as a school, really have a systemic approach to doing this really important DEI work. And so when we started to dip our toes in these conversations, it felt to him that all the eyes were on him, that he was somehow having to represent, the burden of representing, entire groups of people, and that he didn't know where the conversation was going and what it would be like and where it would end. And that was really sort of a difficult and in many ways an unfair experience. And so I think being able to share that with us and have us really listen and reflect and think about how we were really engaging or not engaging all parts of our students and our student community and our faculty community. And so this, I think, really started some conversations where I think we realized as a school that we had some reflection and we had some work to do. And so a small-ish group, I think 10 or 12 of us, for a year spent some time really starting with ourselves in this DEI work. We were fortunate enough to work with 2 consultants from a school that had been doing this work for a little bit longer. And these 2 individuals also were sort of consultants in DEI work as well. And so they really helped us spend a year learning, reading, and really like reflecting. We spent time sort of looking at understanding racial identity development and where are we as individuals in that process. We looked at curriculum audits. We looked at sort of what experiences, affinity experiences we might be able to offer to our students. We looked at sort of who we were as a staff, and it was a really powerful year. And I think one of the amazing things that happened at the end of the year was a commitment to have a leadership position at the school and to have a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We could not have imagined that we would have someone as amazing as Osa, but we sure are lucky that she has joined the Carroll community and has contributed, from day one to this evening. So it was really, I would say that there were some, points of origin that sort of started this work. And I think the great thing is that this type of work doesn't end for us. We're evolving and we're growing and we're learning every day. And that really is part of our mission, that we want to be lifelong learners. And so there's many things that we're going to hear about tonight, but that's a little bit of sort of how things started and sort of what brought us to some of the places that we are today. So I think I'm going to pass it on to Mika, who's just going to, as we talked about, familiarity is just going to help define some of our terms that we'll talk about tonight.
All right, hello everybody and welcome, and we're so glad you made the time to join us tonight. Before we launch into our discussion on all of the ways we are including topics of diversity and social justice in our school, it's great to define some of our terms. We use a lot of acronyms and it can get easy to become lost in wondering what each acronym may mean. So here's a really quick overview. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we often talk about a DEI initiative or a DEI curriculum, and that's what those words stand for, what those letters stand for rather. BIPOC is another term that you'll hear, and that is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So Black people as one group, Indigenous people as another, and people of color as another group that does not include Black and Indigenous people. So people of color could include Asians or Latinx people. Then moving on, we have some other Carroll specific terms. One is FBC, and that stands for Foundations for Brave Conversations. That's a curriculum that I've been developing and you'll hear more about later on tonight. PLC is a term we use at Carroll that stands for Professional Learning Community. And that's where faculty get together to do professional development, to share the work that we're doing, to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and so on. And then finally, we have SEL, and that stands for social emotional learning. And I'm sure Allison Harmon, who just talked, will talk more about our social emotional learning teaching practices that we are instituting at our school. So there's your quick and dirty overview of all of our acronyms. And now let's take a look at the impact of this work on our faculty, staff, parents, and students. And I am going to just pass it off now to my colleague, Kwame Kabla.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Mika, and thank you all for being here tonight. I just want to give you a quick snapshot into how the faculty and staff at Carroll are engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and also just talk about its impact. And as Allison spoke a little bit about earlier, many years ago, the senior admin team felt strongly that we, as a community, first support the faculty through DEI work before we can even begin to do this properly with students. We really felt that as a school, we can't ask students to do DEI work until we as adults are confidently committed to doing it ourselves. And so, we are a growing multicultural community, and our goal is to be proactive about DEI work, which is why preparation in faculty training opportunities are so important. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some examples of both internal and external opportunities for faculty, which are meant to empower us so that we can then empower our students. So some internal opportunities are PLCs, professional learning communities, which Mika just talked a little bit about. And so what PLCs are basically cohorts of roughly 14 faculty and staff members from across all 3 divisions who meet frequently throughout the year to collaborate, to share, to learn. And one of the main focuses of these PLC groups has been centered on DEI, social justice, and looking at how we can build a more inclusive community. And for me, one of the most important parts of the PLCs are that we are challenged as adults to lean into difficult conversations. And as someone that facilitates one of these groups, it's just amazing over the past 3 years that I've been at Carroll at how our language has changed, how perspectives have shifted, and also how people are just willing to take more risks and put themselves in uncomfortable situations. And we also have professional development days focused on DEI. And these are days that are sometimes run by in-house faculty and staff. And we're sometimes guided through workshops and trainings that allow for perspective taking, empathy building, and really just giving us this knowledge and skills to move into our classrooms afterwards. We also have external training opportunities surrounding DEI. I every year have been, grateful that Carroll has sent me to a conference called POCC, or People of Color Conference. And this is a national conference for schools from across the country. And in this conference, we participate in workshops, trainings specifically geared towards educators of color who work predominantly in white institutions. And it's just been wonderful for me to have the school's support in, participating in some of these conferences. There's also NDPI is another example, National Diversity Practitioners Institute. And a quick story, NDPI was the first actual, after I was hired, the first actual work experience I had. Carroll, the first thing they did was send me to NDPI in the summer. And it was a 4-day conference in Maryland. And I was instantly taken back at the other people that were sent to this conference from Carroll. All of them were administrators. All of them were leaders of the school on the senior admin team. And for me, it was a breath of fresh air because it really showed me the school's commitment to DEI work. If we are making or having all of the school leaders do this work, it was something that I never experienced in any of my other previous schools. There's also the ASNE conferences and then the Multicultural Teaching Institute. So all of these opportunities I'm listing are just opportunities outside of Carroll that are presented to our faculty for further growth. We've also had outside speakers, both locally and nationally known. Ali Michael, who works with schools and organizations across the country to research race, whiteness, and education, which really helps. I think her goal is to make this work accessible and relevant to educators. Also, Elizabeth Denevy, who also works nationally to increase equity and promote diversity pedagogy in schools, is another person that's helped guide us in the direction that we've wanted to go. We've also had Rosetta Lee, who I think Osa will talk about a little bit more, and Ruby Bridges has also come to speak to us as a faculty. So if we move to the next slide, I have quickly gone over some of the opportunities that we have at our fingertips at Carroll as a faculty, but I guess the question is, what do we do with it after we get all this training and this ongoing training? What are we doing with this? And this is when this accountability piece comes in, and we have something called the Faculty Growth Plan. And quickly, I'll just explain that every faculty member is required to maintain a growth plan. And each faculty member is supported by a coach. Every person at Carroll has a coach. And every faculty member composes at least 3 goals for the year, which they will continually reflect on with their coach to see, any progress or things that they need to work on. And one of these goals has to be DEI specific. So we're constantly thinking about this progress and how specifically you want to transfer this training that I talked about earlier into the classroom. We also have a BIPOC affinity group for faculty of color. For me, I know this has been a great experience, and I think it's wonderful that the school has acknowledged that there is a need for the faculty of color to have this cohort that is supported by the school. And so it has had a wonderful impact on the faculty. And so to sum this up, I think all of these opportunities help create a stronger community. They help personal growth. They help developing professional and personal skills amongst the faculty. And as an institution, we do understand that DEI work is not only about giving awareness and skills to children, but is also about helping students develop their identities fully. And the more knowledgeable we as a faculty and staff are, the better we can help nurture our students' identities. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Osa, who is going to talk about the impact on parents.
Hello, everyone. It is so nice to see all of you and to be sharing this digital space with you this evening. So thank you, Kwame. And yes, I'm going to spend a little time just talking about the ways that we're engaging with y'all, as well as your students. And so yes, as Kwame mentioned, we are continuing to explore these concepts regularly with our faculty and staff members. And a part of our institutional journey includes wanting to provide similar spaces and opportunities for our families, many of which or whom have very intimate and deep knowledge and expertise around these issues. And so as a result, in the spring of 2019, a group of interested parents got together to form the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity Alliance, which we now coin as IDEA. And I'm really excited and proud about this. This is our first ever kind of parent DEI group. And we're in the beginning stages of our brainstorming, so I welcome any of you who are interested to join us. This is very collaborative, and we are, trying to make sure that we are including as many voices as possible, and we want to be able to really support our community through these learning opportunities. So please join us if you're interested. And to that point, if you haven't already, I also encourage you to consider registering for our book talk on March 25th. This is one of the very few, I think, or probably maybe the first, maybe, I'm not entirely sure, but this is one of the one of our newest and opportunities for our families to kind of talk very openly about issues around race. And we'll be discussing Ijoma Oluo's bestseller novel, So You Want to Talk About Race. And that conversation will be led by Jenna Chandler Ward, whom, as Kwame noted, is well known and respected. And she talks all over the country about these issues. And we are also really lucky to welcome Rosetta Lee to our community in late April. For decades, Rosetta has been a leader in the field of DEI education, and we're really thrilled that she's agreed to spend some time with us, and particularly with you all. And so we're still working on some of those details, but stay tuned. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as a community of educators, one thing that we've noticed is the tremendous impact of our students. And in so many ways, DEI education plays on their strengths. There's so much to talk about, but I will just highlight a few examples. And I'll start with our 5th grade. So our students are participating in a nationwide program by the name of Think Give. And through this program, our kids are building their social and emotional toolkits. They're also learning how to demonstrate radical empathy, and they are discovering opportunities to stand out as leaders in their communities. And this has been a really nice kind of program that gives our kids some real language and opportunities to kind of just, be change agents, which is wonderful. In addition to this, we are also using our morning meeting and advisory blocks to connect with our kids and give them time to listen and question and teach each other about what's going on in our ever-changing world. And it's been really remarkable to see how our youngest and oldest students are benefiting from this intentional and courageous approach. And I'm an advisor this year, and it's been nice just to kind of sit in on those conversations. And I'm really proud of the kids and the work that they're doing. And so I'm feeling very encouraged. And then finally, our community is definitely the strongest when we come together to celebrate our shared and diverse experiences. And in the past, we've brought in dynamic speakers such as the great Ruby Bridges. Our students have participated in theatrical performances that highlight the importance of our principles around empathy, respect, inclusion, and kindness. And every year we spend time talking about the work and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And these are just some of the ways that our kids are engaging in these rich conversations. And I'm really, really, eager and excited about what's ahead because they're eating it up. And it's so nice to see that. It's so nice to see that. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another way that we're kind of helping our kids to think about these things more deeply is through our curriculum. And at our core, our school focuses on building our students' literacy skills. And I think what's beautiful about this work in particular is that by integrating this into their educational programming, we're continuing to build their literacy and capacity, but specifically around issues around race and gender and culture and so on and so forth. And so, it's just ingrained into our mission, and it just makes us do our mission better in many ways, as one of my former colleagues mentioned. And particularly in the BR and 3rd grade, we are engaging our students in developmentally appropriate conversations by using picture books that tie to specific DEI issues. And so there's a variety of books on the left, some of them talking about Indigenous kind of perspectives, socioeconomics, religious perspectives and spiritual perspectives. It's really nice just to kind of give them an array of different topics. And it's great to kind of see our kids talk about their own lived experiences, but also be able to really learn from their classmates, which I'm really appreciative of. And then in our 4th and our 5th grade, our kids are processing these issues and exploring their own identity in a newly developed social justice course, which I teach in addition to one of my really great colleagues. And this has been amazing to see them kind of just dig deep into these conversations. Many of them are bringing some of the current events that are going around in our world to the table. And it's been great to kind of also hear them be able to use language and take these really big concepts that, you know, adults even struggle with, and be able to kind of understand it in a way that's, you know, child friendly, but also gives them hope to be able to make an impact in their community. And so these are just some of the examples, and I'm happy to dig into the others. So please connect with me offline, because I would love to have a conversation further. And so now I'm going to pass it to Mika, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're approaching this work in the middle school.
All right, hello again. So I'm going to talk about 2 initiatives that we're working on right now. One is pertaining to the curriculum, so actual subject, core class. And then another one is on the curriculum that we're calling Foundations for Brave Conversations. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to start by talking about the 7th grade history curriculum. That is the current curriculum project that I'm working on right now. And one of the main things we're working on is changing the focus of the narrative. 7th grade history focuses on the United States, kind of the development of the United States. And actually, I want to just point out that we're actually starting before 1607, and starting with that age of discovery, where we talk about some of the myths and truths about how how North America was discovered, and we do put it in air quotes like that. And then we go all the way up to the American Revolution. And what we want to do is center the narrative on Indigenous people and on Black people, instead of centering the narrative on the founding fathers. Not that we don't talk about them, not that we don't cover all of the essentials about how the Constitution was drafted and other major events that led up to the revolution. But we're focusing on that picture on the left rather than making the narrative what that picture on the right represents. All right, can we go to the next slide? So here are some of the essential questions, those through lines that thread through all of the units in the 7th grade curriculum, which also includes civics. So basics of how our government works. So who has the power in democracy? Is it truly the people? Should it always be the people? How is that power balanced? And I'll just highlight a few of the other questions here. What is justice? These are not questions we expect students to leave the end of 7th grade being able to answer. They're questions we want students to keep asking. One of our main goals is to get students to think very critically and to ask questions, to just keep their minds open and keep asking questions. We do not want students to just sit passively back and digest a bunch of facts and dates. So I'll leave it up there for just a second, and we can move on. Yeah, we can go on. We can go back to it if somebody has a question later. So the primary goal, or a few of the main goals, is to, as I mentioned, place front and center the narratives and perspectives of Black and Indigenous people. On the picture on the left here is one of those people we highlight. His name is Benjamin Banneker, and he had a series of really important conversations with Thomas Jefferson, which challenged how Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. So we're bringing these people into the main narrative. Also highlighting upstanders of European descent. We do not want to have kids walk away from 7th grade thinking all white people are bad. Even though we may kind of debunk some myths that we've had as a nation, we also want to highlight examples of upstanders so that they can see that there's a long legacy of people who have stood up for the right thing. And then finally, one of our primary goals is to develop an understanding of civic engagement, that they know that the people really do have a say in government and what some of the main ways everyday citizens can try to move the needle by talking to or reaching out to their representatives. All right, can go ahead to the next slide. So just to wrap up here, there's no one textbook written for the middle school that does all of these things, accomplishes all of the goals that we're aspiring towards, or that covers all of the essential questions that we're trying to use as through lines through all of the units. So what we're doing in this project is we're pulling material from many of these sources here and others as well, but here are some of the primary ones. And if you're ever curious and want to do some reading on your own, these are also great books for you to read as well. So that's just a snapshot there. And then we can go on. So before I launch into talking about the other curriculum initiative that we're working on this year, which is Foundations for Brave Conversations, I want to pause for a minute and allow you to really contemplate this question here. And maybe if you're sitting with your partner or your family members right now, maybe you can ask each other what you think about the answer to this question. So it is, what is necessary for fostering an environment for safe and effective discussions on topics such as race, ethnicity, gender, sex, class, and I'll add even complicated current events. Not that we have any of those happening. So I'll pause for a second, let you think about that. Okay. So hopefully you've got some thoughts in mind. Here are some of the essentials that we felt students needed to have a safe environment for effective discussions. And those are safety, trust, you see they're at the bottom there, empathy from people that they're talking to and towards people that they're talking to, support, communication, understanding, shared language, and then finally, knowledge. And kind of in that order as well. So these are all of the elements we work on in Foundations for Brave Conversations. They are literally foundations to enable students to be able to start talking about difficult topics. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Building the foundation for enabling effective, difficult conversations is creating an atmosphere where students are comfortable talking about challenging topics, a culturally responsive way to develop social emotional intelligence, a chance to get to know and celebrate each other's identities, and it is the opportunity to develop a shared language to be able to discuss race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. effectively. Our end goal is to get students to really aspire to being anti-racist, but we can't get there until we start really looking inwards at our own identities and then looking outwards to see how other people's identities are fitting into society or not. All right, we can go to the next slide. What it is not launching headfirst into discussions on current events without any shared language, without the safety built, without trust built within the groups that they're having these discussions in, without some understanding of empathy. It is not engaging in discussions that are developmentally inappropriate. So we're not gonna, start talking about and showing endless pictures of George Floyd being killed, for example. It is not indoctrinating students with radical ideas either. It is merely enabling students to be brave and feel comfortable enough to start embarking on these conversations. All right, can go to the next slide. A lot of the way this program, or this curriculum, I should say, has been set up, has been inspired by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's a psychologist, president of Spelman College, and author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So if you're looking for yet another thing to read to explore these issues of how to be an anti-racist person, what anti-racist teaching should look like, what an anti-racist school should look like, and how we're using a lot of her suggestions and philosophy, please check out that book. But she makes a very clear and very important point that if safety and celebration of others' identity is not established, it results in a aversion to topics such as race. I'm sure many of you have been in a situation where somebody has brought up a really sticky topic about race or about gender identity, and maybe you've experienced just shutting down because you don't know what to do, you don't know how to get into it, or maybe you just start joking, or maybe you've brought up the sticky topic and you've gotten that response from somebody else. And those kinds of overt responses come from not having a language, not feeling safe, and not kind of building up that muscle to bravely engage. And she says here, such resistance can ultimately interfere with the cognitive understanding and mastery of the material. That would be the material of really understanding how race and other identities work in our society. This resistance and potential interference is particularly common when specifically addressing issues of race and racism. All right, we can go ahead to the next slide. So, as I said, we begin with identity exploration. So we started this in October, and we do this in advisory so that the entire Carroll community can be involved in this. So all middle school advisors, regardless of what subject classes they teach, and all upper school advisors as well, sit down during our flex time and have engage with these conversations with our students in small groups of 4 this year, which is even better. So a very intimate group, they're already building that trust with the adults in the room. And we start with the identity exploration. And these pictures here are the result of some artwork that students did at the end of our initial identity exploration unit. And what identity exploration does is it reduces the tendency to respond out of fear or defensiveness to difficult topics. And then it also, you can go to the next slide, primes participants to value others' personal experience, creates an atmosphere of empathy where listening to each other is a guiding principle. Listening is super key and super emphasized. It sets the stage for speaking from one's own experience, an essential practice for effective discussions. It allows everyone the chance to reflect on how they have or have not experienced privilege, stereotype, and bias. And it challenges participants to explore and acknowledge their own assumptions and biases of others. All right. So that pretty much wraps up a summary of the curriculum that we're working on this year, and we're hoping to build on and expand on in the coming years. And I am going to hand the baton off to Kwame, who will talk about student conferences and alliance groups.
Hello again. Yes, as Mika said, I'm going to talk. I talked about some of the faculty opportunities surrounding DEI work, and now I'm going to talk about some of the student opportunities surrounding this work. And so Mika just spent some time doing a great job talking about Foundations for Brave Conversations, which is what I think is amazing because it is embedded into our everyday at Carroll. And also, we have opportunities for students to learn about inclusivity and to have brave conversations that continue beyond the classroom, and opportunities for them to have these discussions even further. An example of this is that we have social justice groups, and these tackle current event topics that are popping up for them in their lives. The way that we set these up in the middle school is that we meet as one large group just called the social justice group. Any student who is interested can join. And from there, we branch out into smaller groups, which students can self-select based on their interests. And so we have these groups that are focused. One of them is focused on racial justice. One focuses on environmental issues, LGBTQ rights, and really anything that the students wish to discuss. If anything, the most important part of these groups is that we are providing this safe space for the students who might share common experiences. And each of these groups are run by a committed faculty member who facilitates these conversations. These are what I think amazing opportunities for students, and it's really important to recognize that it's an opportunity for the school to listen to and tap into the needs and issues that are coming up for our students, and to get a read on what's going on in their worlds that maybe we should be addressing or considering. It gives us an opportunity to check the temperature on how to make things safer and more inclusive as we are a growing multicultural school. Some conferences that, some yearly conferences that our students frequently attend are the ASNE Middle School Diversity Conference, ASNE standing for Association of Independent Schools New England. We always have a group of students that attend these conferences. We have the Students of Color Conference, which I believe just happened 3 weeks ago, and we had a good group of students go there. And the students get to participate in workshops, meet other students from other schools, collaborate, communicate, and socialize with students who have these shared and lived experiences in middle school. And in 2017, a very proud moment, we had a group of students actually run a workshop for faculty and students at the Fenn School. It was called the Multicultural Educators Forum. And the topic that our students discussed for a very full room of, as I said, faculty and students was the power of dyslexia. And I say it's a proud moment because the courage that it took for our students to speak about their own journey with dyslexia and what it means for them being a part of their identity, and also their maturity in educating people about all of the things that they can do, and kind of shifting this whole narrative about dyslexia being something all about things that you can't do. And so they talked about the dyslexic advantage, and I think it was just a beautiful moment where our students took ownership and leadership And we're really committed to this presentation. And I think it shed a lot of light on our school as a whole, and really just showed how committed we are to kind of guiding our students in search of finding their identity and creating these global citizens who are empathetic and thoughtful, and willing to participate in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so these are just a few examples of how we try to engage our students and give them other opportunities, possibly outside of Carroll, for them to continue these conversations, because we do have such a large group of students that are curious about this world and how it works, and have so many questions. And I think this allows or feeds that curiosity through all of these opportunities. And so I'm going to hand this off to Allison, I believe.
Yeah, thanks, Kwame. Yeah, I remember that conference. It was such a great day to be with our students and work with them and support them in preparing and sort of sharing their experience as really amazing dyslexic learners. So I think we wanted to kind of finish up with just sort of tying in what we see as the relationship between DEI work and social emotional wellness. I think of them as really inextricably linked. So, on the first slide here, we talk a lot at Carroll about this whole child approach. And by whole child, simply, we just mean that, we have this awareness that kids don't live in vacuums. They live within families, they live within schools, they live within communities and societies. And so we need to be sort of looking systemically at kids within these contexts to be thinking about how to guide them through an educational experience. And we also need to be thinking about sort of different domains of their development. So kids develop physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, spiritually. They have identity development. And so if we're really just focused on their academics and not really attending to some of these other areas, then in some ways we're kind of limiting their academic development, because all of these things are sort of happening in conjunction with each other. As I mentioned earlier, kids don't come to Carroll just with sort of one part of their identity and sort of leave everything else at home or in the bus or in the car. They're really coming in with sort of all of themselves. And so I think if we're not attending to those different areas, then we're really not sort of affirming kids and helping them to feel understood and seen and supported. And if they're not feeling that way, it's really hard to learn. And there's so many experiences that we've had where, we can understand that we can have the most amazing education and academics and the most dedicated faculty. But if kids aren't feeling supported and affirmed, and I think in their identity is one way of needing that, then they're just less available for learning. So when they're not feeling whole, they're not going to really benefit from all the amazing academics that Carroll has to offer. So I think as we've tried to really look at this whole child approach and let it guide us, we've realized that having strong DEI work is really right at the center of that approach. So if we go on to the next slide here, why is this work so important? And it's not just that it feels like the right thing to do, and it's not just that it's been a really compelling, rewarding experience personally engaging in a lot of this work. There are really well-researched benefits to incorporating DEI work within a school community. There are educational benefits. And actually, there's been research around students who are exposed to other students who have differences and have to sort of be exposed to novel ideas and even challenge their own ways of thinking, that this type of environment actually leads to improved cognitive skills, things like critical thinking and problem solving. And so it actually enhances education to be in this diverse community. Psychologically, when we have increased positive perceptions of ourselves, this lessens feelings of insecurity and vulnerability. And as I said before, if we just think about it rationally, if we're not feeling secure, if in sort of who we are and how our community sees who we are, then it's going to be really hard to learn. When we're feeling really anxious or unsupported, they've done a lot of research that your working memory actually really tanks when you're having high levels of stress and anxiety. And so if that stress and anxiety is because you're in a school community that isn't sort of supporting who you are, then you're just going to be less available for learning. There was a great book that our faculty read a few years ago called Whistling Vivaldi. Many of you have probably heard of it, by Dr. Claude Steele, but he talks about the power of bias and how as humans, we all have this sort of implicit bias, and how this affects student achievement, and that there's a really strong link between stereotype threat, so having the burden of having to always either disprove or be aware of these stereotypes, and that there are really strong correlations to student achievement. So it was a really sort of enlightening book for all of us to read and to think about how that impacts our work as educators. And certainly social emotional benefits. When kids are practicing DEI work, they are really developing positive character traits. Kwame talked about in the conferences and the affinity groups, kids are really developing leadership skills and communication skills. And also from the social perspective, that when kids are engaged in, whether it's through the Foundations of Brave Conversation and some of that work, or even just in language classes or history classes, or when they're in multis and they're in art and they're becoming exposed to really diverse material, that all of these things allow kids to become more sort of civically engaged. And I think it was Mika that mentioned a little bit about equipping kids to be able to be critical thinkers about like complex world events. And this year has been really challenging. There have been unprecedented events that we have felt compelled as a school to be able to offer space to kids to talk about these. And although we would never force any one particular agenda on any student, it's been really amazing to support students in being able to use those critical thinking skills. And it was so helpful when I think about some of the conversations that we had around the time of the election. It was so helpful to have this basis for how to have really respectful, brave conversations, and that we had practiced that in these small advisory groups. And I think that allowed kids to really talk and listen to each other, and listen across differences. We wouldn't expect that kids all have the same perspective, but I think really being able to both have self-awareness of your own perspective, but be able to be open to really listening and hearing another, allowed us to work through some pretty unprecedented events. So I think if we go to the last slide here, and I think I sort of said this a little bit, but I think that we really think about social emotional learning, those skills, and DEI skills as really one and the same. And so just to break it down specifically, like we're really talking about, active listening, being able to listen and say, did I hear you correctly? Is this what you were saying? Being able to identify and express emotions, being able to understand your own perspective, but also listen to the perspective of someone else and imagine what that might be like, being able to advocate and problem solve. And this has been really important, and really some, incredible sort of counseling interactions that I've had with kids who have maybe come to a trusted adult or come to me and talked about when they've had an experience that that felt hurtful in some way, or felt like, some kids have become educated and have been using the term, microaggression, an experience that where they have felt sort of hurt or harmed in some way. And I think being able to support kids in listening to each other, and thinking about what reparative actions can I take, what restorative actions can I take, both towards an individual or as part of a school community. I think we've tried to do that with each other as adults and also model for our students how important that is to have a whole community. So I think on that note, I'm going to do a quick time check. We are almost at 8 o'clock. And I know that was when we were hoping to wrap up and field some questions. But I also just want to mention before I hand it back to Stacy, and Osa talked about this as well, that just a big plug for these two women on your screen, Jenna Chandler Ward and Rosetta Lee. They are both, I've had the privilege of listening to both of them speak in sort of large and smaller settings. Really, really powerful, important work, definitely worth checking out. So just a final plug for coming events. So Stacy, I'll hand it back to you now.
Allison, thank you so much. And thank you to Mika, Kwame, and Osa for a really fantastic and enlightening presentation. And so some of you have used the Q&A button to ask some questions, which I'm going to pose to the panel. And please feel free for others who haven't asked yet to really ask us your questions. And this is a space for difficult and brave conversations and candid ones. One question that we got was that there's been some use of the language anti-racist teaching and anti-racist schools and culturally responsive teaching in other settings. Osa, could you help us to understand more about what these terms mean and if they're distinct or part of the DEI work, or how they fit in rather?
Yeah, so like many terms that you may be hearing right now in the world, they're these are quite common and they're interconnected, and sometimes people use them interchangeably. From my understanding, anti-racist teaching is a teaching practice that really looks at deepening a student's racial justice literacy, and doing that specifically by highlighting the impacts of systemic racism. Whereas culturally responsive teaching is an approach that highlights and integrates students' kind of cultural identity throughout their learning process. And I think, to do culturally responsive teaching authentically, you certainly have to include an anti-racist framework. I think, in the past, DEI education has gotten some critique because many have felt that it's kind of too surface level. It doesn't really go deeper. But here at Carroll, the way that we understand and are approaching the DEI education is both a reflection of both the anti-racist teaching and culturally responsive teaching. And I think we continue to evolve in our thinking and our learning, and so revisiting those approaches and finding the ones that are up and coming, even that align best with our work, is something that we are definitely doing. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Osa. Thanks.
Yeah.
Another question that we got, and I think this one would be probably for you, Mika. And with all respect, this parent wanted to ask is, are we being balanced and holistic in our view of history? I mean, we were all, at least for myself and perhaps some other parents, schooled in a very different way. And how are we navigating what are sort of newer realizations with the facts as they were presented to us in the past, and facts with quotation fingers, right?
Right. I also started thinking about back to my education as well, and those textbooks that had like one little box off to the side at the end of the chapter or at the end of the unit that maybe had a little bit of something about Harriet Tubman or something like that. And what we're doing, instead of putting one or two Black or Indigenous people off to the side, we're bringing them into the mainstream narrative, right? So for example, instead of starting with the first colony in the United States, which was Jamestown, instead of only focusing on how the settlers had a hard winter and all of the way of life that they lived, and just briefly mentioning Pocahontas and then moving on, we're going to talk about why those settlers came, and then their interactions with the Powhatan Nation, and how that Powhatan Nation had to contend with the new settlers in the land. and how that descendants of ancestors of the Powhatan Nation are living today, and is it still impacting them today, right? Yes, it's new information that maybe if you have a 7th grade student, can share with you later on. And that's also why I showed that slide of the sources that we're using, in case you also want to delve into these topics yourself. But we're not erasing the standard history to replace it with only BIPOC people, right? What we're doing is we're making them a primary part of the narrative, just like George Washington was the primary part of the narrative. And students, like that picture I showed, 2 pictures side by side, one of an Indigenous child standing in front of the Constitution, and then one of the framers of the Constitution on the side. Students, we actually counted all of the people who were in that frame signing of the Constitution slide picture, just because when we went through how the Constitution was written, and how all of the colonies sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and we talked about how there were 50 of them. We actually went in and counted to see if the painting had all 50. So it's not like we're not bringing them in, we're ignoring them all completely, but we're trying to balance things because it has been an imbalanced history that a lot of students have gotten. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Mika. Thanks. A couple other questions. One was, sort of for a couple of statistics, both the BIPOC community with the faculty and staff, and then a similar question on the student side. And what I could say is for the faculty, we are at about 15%. The student number is a little harder to get at because we rely on self-identification. And so we think it's in the neighborhood of between 15 and 20%, some estimate in there, just going by, again, what people self-report. And I think, Allison, and maybe Osa, question for you here, some wise parent observed that children sort of naturally accept each other. And how is Carroll working to create a culture of greater acceptance for some of the broader diversity that we have been more recently bringing to the Carroll community?
Allison, I can start and you can jump in if that feels good.
Perfect.
I think, yes, that children, I think it's one of their gifts, right? That they are just so pure and are definitely, quite inclusive from the get-go. And so one of the things that we do is to help continue to foster that is to be really explicit in our teaching. So that way we can kind of give kids language and preview and allow them to be able to understand different perspectives and be able to really be more accepting on an authentic level. There's a lot of research out in the world that kind of talks about like how kids can also recognize differences really early on, specifically around race, as toddlers, even I think at the age of 3 or sometimes, or even younger. And so they recognize colors, they recognize skin colors, they recognize that we are different races, but they might not understand what it means to have a racial identity, right? And so that's kind of where we step in to be able to provide that context. They may not understand kind of the history around the way that people with different racial identities are being treated, in this world, in this country, but also just globally. And so through the work that we're doing, we're giving that kind of context and giving them an opportunity to be able to understand the full picture, as well as keep that little light that's within them, right? And so hopefully we're doing a good balance of that. But I think that's kind of how I would approach that question. And Allison, if there's anything else that you want to add to that, please go for it.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful response. I'm thinking about, there's sort of this idea of windows and mirrors, that, all kids need windows and mirrors. So the windows being like experiences that help them like see through to the perspective of somebody else, and mirrors being that like kids also need to sort of look around and be able to see some version of themselves in their school community. And so I think being, as Osa said, like a little more overt and intentional about both, continuing to try and increase the diversity of our faculty and our students, and also just experientially. There's a great book that we also read as a faculty by Zaretta Hammond called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. Did I get that right? And it really just had so many like concrete practices that you can bring into the classroom, even like, what do your walls look like? And what, do kids have sort of visibility signs that feel affirming to sort of different parts of them? What are the books on your shelf? I mean, obviously we're looking at like the actual curriculum, but what are all the sort of more nuanced things that make up a school community that kids can sort of look around and either see some version of themselves or learn about something that is a difference from who they are. So I think being sort of much more intentional and starting young, like starting with the BRs and going, right through to ninth grade, and thinking developmentally too about, what are kids at different developmental ages curious about, and having opportunities to like lean into those conversations, as opposed to just thinking that they'll somehow, intuit it and, grow with it. We're trying to sort of bring it forward a little bit more.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you both. Some of the other questions we sometimes get, and I'll kind of field this one a little bit myself, maybe with you, Osa, is we have a board of trustees who's sort of quite active in this school, and we're lucky at Carroll. We have a fantastic board of people who place a lot of trust in the institution. And I think most recently, they have also started engaging in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we have as a faculty and staff and student body. And in following our lead, they have developed a more comprehensive lens by which to make decisions on behalf of the institution. And we had always looked at it from the financial perspective or the marketing perspective or at the advancement level. But more recently, Osa, I think we've added an additional lens that maybe I could let you talk to.
Yeah. So we've kind of thought about kind of the work of the board, right? And how, this work has to be institutional. So it has to start and end with everyone. And so the board has recently kind of included a DEI like framework and lens that will help kind of inform their decisions in the same way that they use like a financial framework or a mission framework to decide anything that is in relation to the school. And so I'm really proud of that. I think that's a really critical and definitive step. And it doesn't kind of just check, go through the motions of like checking off a box or leaving it just to the work of faculty and staff and students and parents. But I think that demonstrates some partnership from the board to the rest of the community. And I'm grateful for that action. And so I'm really excited to see where it takes us.
Thanks, Osa. Thanks. And thanks to all the parents in the Q&A who are putting in supportive comments. I mean, we love those and the the sort of more honest questions too, but we appreciate the support. And I think one, just to kind of end this off in a way, we have as a school made a very intentional effort to bring diversity with a capital D, people who represent all different forms of it to Carroll. And it has been the work that we have started, 5-6 years ago, as Allison said, and have done a tremendous amount of outreach to communities and particularly to educators. I think for a lot of us, and many of you may know or not, that I am a parent of a Carroll alumni. We arrived at Carroll with the help of an educator because we as parents, at least I didn't know very much about dyslexia. And I think that this in some circles happens more often than others. And so it has been our great joy as part of the admission and senior leadership team to increase the faces at Carroll, right? And the lived experiences and the sort of broad backgrounds that we all bring. And so, and in part, I thank all of you parents who support us in this work and trust us with your children. And so on that note, unless there's any further comments from the panel, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all our panelists and to you all parents. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Enjoy it in good health, and let's hope for good weather as well. And again, thank you, Osa, Kwame, Allison, and Mika, and to Jen Brock and Antoinette Truman. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Good night.